Hello, thank you everyone for joining us. It's just about 4 p.m. on the East Coast, June 11th. It's a Tuesday. We are joined with our friends at Global Wired Advisors. And the point of this webinar is to really just dig deep into understanding all the aspects when it comes to selling your business. So we've been kind of building this roadmap the past few weeks from really, you wake up one day and say, hey, I want to start a business and I have this product idea, but where do I start to make sure that my end goal is selling a business? Being an entrepreneur is really exciting. It's something that is really life-changing because you get a lot more freedom. You get to choose what you do. But when it comes to actually selling your business, nothing is more life-changing than being able to turn over business and sell it for millions of dollars, something that you've built from nothing. So we've got our guys at Global Wired Advisors. They are going to be walking us through everything. I'm going to turn the time over to them. They've got their presentation up and ready to go, and I will mute myself. Go ahead, introduce yourself, say hello in the chat. I will be taking any questions, and we'll be addressing them during our Q&A portion at the end. Thank you guys for joining us. How are you today?
Doing good.
Hey, Kate. Hi to all your listeners and the webinar viewers. We're obviously here today to talk about all these aspects of enterprise value and selling your business when the time is right. And I think we're gonna step through. We've got a lot of material to cover today. The great thing is that the slides that we've prepared for those that want to see a replay will be there, and you'll be able to review them.
That's right.
And so we're just going to step through. We might not cover all of it, but it'll be there to review if you want to, if your viewers want to. So, I think the first step that we wanted to cover today, it's not necessarily the most important step, but just the first step is just covering value related to intellectual property. Intellectual property is, at its core, really just what makes you unique. It's what usually is intangible in nature about your company. It's things that you've maybe created, ideas. And, when you consider basic economics and drivers of value, it's also it's scarcity. And scarcity is what drives valuation higher. So, when you think about intellectual property and intellectual property rights, there's things that come to mind. Maybe through your life, you've been involved and come across this in various ways. You think of electronics, pharmaceuticals often, are secured by this. You think about music, back in the day when there was Napster, there was intellectual property rights, but nobody was honoring it, and today that's all different. Movies, things like Coca-Cola's recipe, right? It's a very vast landscape of categories and types of intellectual property. One example that came to mind, we were talking about this before the webinar got going, is Nestle. A lot of people know Nestle. It's a multinational food and drink company. It's actually the largest one in the world, and they make all sorts of different products. One that's very near and dear to my heart, and ours as a firm, is actually their Nespresso machine and their coffee. You might not know this, but it was actually invented by an employee back in 1976. And they're covered by, protected by, at one point, 1,700 patents. And so you think about, this machine and the capsule that goes into the machine and in the process of making an espresso, 1,700 different patents worldwide. And, at one point, the company started to lose that patent protection. And what they ended up doing is they ended up creating what was known as a three-dimensional trademark to try and protect what was now coming off patent. Mm-hmm. It effectively amounted to a design patent, and it's going to continue to cover them until 2021. But, it's just an example of something that, a company uses to protect what over time has produced hundreds of millions of dollars, probably several billions actually, of enterprise value and revenue for them. When you think about types, we mentioned patents, there's trademarks. Many of you who are listening today have experience with this in trademarking and in branding. various databases. Some of you have your own websites and you have databases and customer lists. This is intellectual property and it's valuable. And also there's trade secrets to the extent that what you're manufacturing or producing for the market is unique. There might be certain methods that you go through. And so often in our work, we come across most often patents, trademarks, and different types of branding that our clients usually have undertaken to create intellectual property and property rights in their business. And as you can imagine, similar to other assets, these can be valued, and they are valued, and they're valued differently often than different types of assets that you would have on a balance sheet. So, when we engage with our clients, when we talk to them, we discuss this and we bring this up, and I think it's important to do. It's a lot more. It's not just one dimensional. There's a lot of aspects related to this that drive the value over time, and also that goes into the enterprise valuation of a company and the sale of it. And, in some sense, there is a lot more art that's involved than just sort of science when it comes to it. We're going to be discussing valuation methods later. But, when it comes to intellectual property rights, often it is a lot more art, if you will, that goes into it. I think that, because there's value there and because it's an actual asset of the business, these can be transferred. And that is a key piece of many, if not, the majority of our engagements do have some aspect of this involved. And we spend a lot of time, diving into what those are so that we can understand and go through that in a sale transaction. But intellectual property is and can be transferred. There's value to that. There's also title to that, legal title to these assets that can be conveyed to another party, and that can be in whole or in part. And so, consideration has to be given. That can be done in many different ways. And, what we see most often is that it's sold in whole as part of these transactions, but there's licensing and royalty agreements that can be undertaken as well so that there's a future revenue stream. And, as you can appreciate, it's a vast subject and it goes very deep. So, but I think it's important to discuss as part of, going through the sale and transaction process for companies, especially ones where there's key branding and consumer product focus to truly understand this, because it really is what makes you unique. And we talked about at the beginning, just a minute or two ago, various categories as it relates to intellectual property and different types of, just as an example. And I think that Chris now is going to touch on, categories and how that impacts the valuation a little bit more.
That's right. So just kind of moving along, category matters is the next subject that we're going to touch on. So I listed out here just some top selling categories for on Amazon in 2018, which, really carries through almost all e-commerce. We won't touch on these. I want to quickly move over and talk about what do you look for? So when you're growing an Amazon business, when you're starting out, maybe you're in the middle of growing your business and you're looking to expand. What are the things that you should look for in terms of category, in terms of product, right? The product is king. So let's talk through what you should look for. Some of these are going to be very obvious, but, number one, you got to look at profitability. If the thing isn't making any money, it's worth nothing. It's pretty simple. The second thing you want to look for is saturation. As you go and you're exploring the Amazon platform, as you're looking at the other e-commerce competition, how saturated is this category? Because if there's a lot of saturation, you got to understand it's going to cost a lot of money to get to the top of to rank for your products. It's going to cost a lot more in terms of just advertising in general. Does this product have long-term growth? Is it something that can not only grow, but then grow into other things and morph into other things? We call that a product roadmap. So you're thinking about widget X, but can widget X actually turn into maybe 10 more SKUs and complementary SKUs? All these things help protect your products, protect your brand, protect your business. We say art and science around here a lot. I put on here, it's not luck, it's science. So you really want to dive in look at the data. You want to think through the type of products that you're actually wanting to get into. Next slide. So one category benefits versus multiple category benefits. So one category benefit, it's easier to grow a brand. Brand is really important as more and more Amazon businesses are growing, more and more e-commerce, digitally native businesses are growing. Having a brand really sets you apart in the pack and makes you more attractive to a potential buyer pool. It also allows you to have stronger focus. So instead of having to focus on 10 different product categories, you get to really have that domain knowledge and really kind of that domain saturation and a lot of focus when it comes to one category. Now, multiple category does come with its benefits. You have diversification that helps mitigate SKU risk. It also allows you to test out some different profitability models. Going on to the next one here. However, what's most attractive to a buyer pool is going to be something that's what we call a vertical brand. So it's a vertical category. It's easier, as I mentioned earlier, to sell to a larger buyer pool. And then one category, its complementary categories lends itself to having a brand. So if you have one category you're focused on, like we mentioned earlier about the product roadmap, you can then create more products to go around that, and you really start to build a loyal following in essence, and you have brand loyalty. These are things that really help you get ahead of the pack in terms of bringing your business to market and eventually having that successful transaction. So I'll end with research, right? It's not luck, it's science. You really want to think through what you're getting into. You really want to think about the products that you want to sell and that you want to place on the Amazon platform. So next, we're going to bring up Mr. Jason Somerville to talk through purchasing an Amazon business and also the psychology behind selling your Amazon business. So I'm going to slide on over here and
we'll do our best weekend update.
That's right.
Impression here. Well, since I'm new on screen, I'll say hi, even though no one can say hi back, and then kind of jump right in. So we've done other webinars and had other podcasts walking through the sort of technical process of selling an Amazon business. We're not going to necessarily focus on that today, but what we're going to do first is kind of put you in the seat of a potential buyer. Obviously, with any given situation, it's good to know what the person or company or party across the table is thinking. What's their mindset like? Understanding that can often help you in understanding the process overall and ultimately getting the very best outcome. So what we wanted to do today for, since the majority of the audience here on this webinar would be in the seller seat, is to give you that glimpse into the mind of the buyer. So the first thing I want to kind of do is walk you through where many buyers tend to begin the journey. There are different types. We've covered this in more detail on a previous presentation, but to kind of recap a little bit, there's individuals who tend to purchase businesses that are primarily on Amazon. There's also larger institutional kind of purchasers, aggregators, private equity firms, things of that nature. And then there are also strategic buyers who tend to look for something a little more specific that marries up well with the company that they already have. So again, let's say a large cosmetics company wants to purchase a different cosmetics company that's primarily selling on Amazon. That would be an example of a strategic buyer. So, but the common thread across all of those is that somewhere along the way, they decided to look for acquisition opportunities where the acquisition targets are primarily selling on Amazon. So most likely they will arrive at the conclusion after a lot of research and the creation of what we call the acquisition criteria. So what we tend to find more often than not is the criteria starts out fairly loose, not specifically narrow. The one exception to that would be some strategic acquirers who are in a very specific product type or category. But what we find is most buyers of these businesses, start out with relatively loose criteria based on general product types, specific attributes like, consumables is a theme that's fairly common now. Higher ticket or lower ticket, there's different philosophies around that. margin targets, cash flow targets, things like that. So these are just a few of the criteria that these buyers tend to look at when developing kind of the box that they're looking for opportunities in. The next slide really kind of talks about the funding plan. So one of the first things that a potential buyer will do is try to figure out, well, where is the capital going to come from for this purchase? How much of it is going to be equity? How much of it is going to be debt? What's that mix going to ultimately look like? And that will often drive really the size of enterprise value that they're looking for. So if a buyer is looking for something in the $2 to $4 million range, okay, they didn't just pick that number out of a hat. Ultimately, it came from the understanding of what their access to capital was, and if they'd be able to deploy that capital within that target price range. Now that they have a funding strategy and the criteria that'll guide their search, they begin to attempt to locate a potential target. So there are a lot of ways that happens. We could actually probably do a whole webinar on that by itself, but I won't. But suffice it to say, both through their efforts and the efforts in the market in general, it's not terribly difficult for buyers to become aware of most, if not all, of the opportunities that are available in the marketplace. But that is really sort of the next step. They begin the search in earnest because they're armed with their funding plan and armed with their search criteria. So the next step is for this potential buyer to start reviewing opportunities. I think that one key point here that I really want to focus in on is most acquirers will look at a lot of different opportunities, and before they ultimately make an offer to purchase any. And that's even if the first one they come across is something they really may like or may kind of hit close to the target. It's the natural tendency of the market to want to have choice and want to have alternatives and to compare and contrast opportunities. So that's something that most buyers will do. Tens, sometimes even hundreds of opportunities they'll review before ultimately making an offer to purchase any. During this review journey, what they're really trying to do is hit a bullseye that they created in that criteria creation process. So they're looking for something relatively perfect, and then as time goes on, if they haven't found something perfect, perfect becomes really good becomes good, and good becomes satisfactory as the search continues. So it tends to evolve over time. But the first thing that they do in terms of determining if they would like to a buyer would like to dig in further in an opportunity is review a teaser document. That's usually a 2 to 3 page document. That's what we produce that very confidential way, kind of an anonymous way, describes the transaction or the potential target company. And that ultimately determines, hey, is there enough information here as a buyer for me to feel like I'm interested in learning more? In order for them to learn more and get any real details on the business, they'll need to sign a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement in order to get anything detailed. Now, we produce very detailed offering memorandums for transactions. They're usually 30, 40, 50, 60 pages. So there's a lot of information there, and confidentiality is incredibly important. So we want to make sure that anyone with access to any kind of real detail has signed an agreement. So the next step, again, after a buyer reviews the offering memorandum, they will ask what we usually call kind of an opening round of questions. After a review of all the information provided, it will generate a lot of questions. So they provide those questions, looking for, again, fairly high-level answers there. Still digging in a little bit deeper, a layer or two down. But again, just trying to determine, am I still interested in moving forward and potentially looking at this even closer? So after those first 1 to 2 rounds of questions, it usually becomes fairly clear if a buyer has a really strong interest in the opportunity. If they do, then normally what they're going to do next is have a conversation with ownership. And that ownership discussion typically will lead to one of two things, usually a fork in the road. Either the buyer is really interested in the business and wants to make an offer, or they'll move on to other opportunities at that point. So once a buyer makes an offer to purchase the business and that offer is accepted, the deal moves into the due diligence and closing phase. There's a lot that happens in this phase. I won't go into a ton of detail, but suffice it to say that, for the next 60 days, what a buyer is trying to do is verify everything that they've learned about the business, make sure that they feel like financials are accurate, information that was presented is accurate, and at the same time produce transaction documents through their attorney, and ultimately get any capital lined up for the closing. So that's what's happening in that 60-day roughly process is what it tends to average. And a few of the things that as a seller, you can be expected will be requested: tax returns, bank statements, monthly financials, seller central reports, material contracts, physical asset information, organizational formation and good standing documents, intellectual property documentation. Chris covered that earlier. Things like this are part of a normal due diligence process. And really what a buyer is trying to do is, is verify that what they were told is true. Excuse me. Pardon me, I'm going to pause for a second, get a drink. Yes.
Well, I skip ahead.
All right, I'll try to continue. Excuse me. So I think we were here at the end of this, correct?
That's right.
All right. After that awkward silence here, I'll try to continue with my hoarse voice. Perfect. So,
Push through.
actually, no, I need to go back one. So I think just to kind of close this out, once the due diligence is complete and a buyer is kind of satisfied that what they've found in due diligence lines up with what they're looking for, ultimately you're going to move to closing. And really, as a buyer, what you're trying to do there is hit the ground running right after closing. So as you're moving into the final days of the transaction, it's really about, from the buyer viewpoint, getting the documents done and signed and getting the money moved, but making sure that on day one they're ready to go and start really moving forward with the transition plan and ultimately running the business. So the next part of this that I'm going to cover is the selling process, but it's a little different than how we've covered it before. We've done something before that's much more technical and specific, a little bit like what we just went through from the buyer's perspective. What I'd rather do today is talk a little bit about the psychological journey of sellers. I think it's an important thing to kind of go through, especially I think it will help anyone who owns a company be prepared for the journey ahead. So, and the kinds of ups and downs, psychologically that you might go through, because this process is a practical one, but it's also a personal one, and it's also, one that has, it has a lot of complexity, and there are a lot of emotions involved. And so, the first order of business, obviously, as the owner of a business that potentially wants to exit, is to make the first step. And the first step is deciding that you would like to, execute a transaction, some kind of an exit, transaction. There are a number of motivations, and these are the most common ones that we see that can drive that decision.
financial motivations are often, right at the top of the list. The idea of cashing out or believing that the ROI on a sale is attractive purely financially. The numbers make sense. That's, I would say, probably first and foremost the most common one. The next most common one are personal motivations, and those include just burnout. You've run the business long enough, you're kind of tired of it, ready to do something else. Illness, death, marriage, children, divorce can all lead a business owner to seek a sale. So, in the beginning, that decision to look, at exit options can be driven by all of these things, and often is. Competitive motivations, that's another one that actually we're seeing more and more in the Amazon world, where legacy business owners that have owned and operated Amazon businesses during times where, let's say, business was just easier, not as many competitors, not as many rogue sellers, and margins being fatter. They're looking to say, well, I miss the good old days, so I want to sell the company and move on to other things. So, and then another one which we see a lot, especially again recently in the Amazon world for Amazon business owners, is FOMO and hearing about other business owners doing deals that sound really attractive, and that really will oftentimes drive business owners to investigate what a sale might look like. So you've made the decision to sell. Sort of, now what? I think one of the key things to point out is that most Amazon, owners of Amazon businesses and sellers have never actually sold a company before. And they have, really zero experience with mergers and acquisitions of any kind. So that can cause a lot of different emotions and thoughts. Curiosity and anxiety are the top two usually. Here's a shameless plug. I would say that the next step in the journey would be to find the right jungle guide. That's the phrase we use oftentimes, saying you need a good jungle guide to get you through this process. Certainly, we feel that we're the best jungle guide out there, but you need one. And we would never, almost never, never say never, right? Almost never would we recommend that someone go it alone on the journey. The only exception I can think is if someone has actually, sold a company or been a professional merger and acquisition advisor in their past life. So, I want to be very, we'll call it blunt. If a business owner works with a professional, highly competent M&A firm, the next 6 to 9 months will still have ups and downs. Be prepared for a journey. It's definitely a marathon, not a sprint. Be prepared for there to be days filled with excitement and days filled with aggravation. That's just sort of keeping it real, honestly. Even if you have the right jungle guide, because even we, can't move mountains entirely, and the human element when other variables are involved always adds levels of complexity and potential sticking points. So, here's some examples of kind of those ups and downs. As the process kicks off, usually from a business seller perspective, business owner, excitement levels really high. And then as, potential buyers are starting to review the opportunity and kind of come and go, I think business owners sober up a little bit and realize that not every party that starts out interested in potentially acquiring them ultimately decides to move forward. There will be many, many counterparties that ultimately review the transaction, most of whom will move on to other things. And so it's good to kind of understand that and not be negatively affected by that, because it's just how the process works. Now, as offers begin to come in, the excitement ramps back up. But as those offers are negotiated and their sticking points arise, business owners kind of sober up again and realize that perfect offers are usually somewhat rare. Again, just kind of things that you can look forward to as you sell your company, and understanding the real truth of the journey. The next slide is kind of a bit of an aside, but I like to point it out because, we have a wide range of clients in terms of their, what their level of caring is, or how much importance they put on the kind of buyer that purchases the company. Some clients don't care. They have very little opinion or ultimately assign very little importance. As long as they get the deal terms they want, they're fine for anybody to ultimately buy the company. Others have a very personal connection with the business, really treat it like a child, and only want to hand it off to someone or a counterparty that really meets their criteria, and that goes well above and beyond just deal terms. And the one thing we found is a lot of business owners don't normally find out really where they fall on that spectrum until the real offers start coming in from potential counterparties. So it gets something to think about as an Amazon business owner. How much do you care about something like that? So you just accepted an offer. What's next from the psychological standpoint? So you accepted the offer, excitement's at a high. You go into due diligence and documentation, which is typically, again, a 60-day process. There's a lot of work involved, and usually at some point, a seller who has never been through a deal before, gets to the point where they're like, how much more information can these people possibly need? I've given them everything. I've given them a blood sample. Like, what's the story? And ultimately they just haven't been through it before, so they don't, they're not used to it. But so again, that's a part of the marathon, and the excitement on day one is really high, and then by day 20 or 30, you're kind of like, all right, I'm ready for this thing to end now. And then once you're kind of really, the finish line is in sight, that's when what I would call kind of the calm, controlled happiness starts to settle over a business seller owner, and the life after the sale plans really start to take shape. And then you finish off and you close the transaction. There's usually some transition work to be done, but the deal's closed. There's a sense of relief, accomplishment, excitement. There's obviously usually a big financial reward at the end. All those things happen, and business owners feel really, really good. And really, we say around here a lot, take on what's next. That's what happens. It's time to take on what's next, whether that's personal, professional, both, so on and so forth. So I think that's gonna conclude my portion. We're gonna get into some valuation factors. Joe, actually Hogg's gonna join me on the weekend update desk.
Right. Slide into place. Perfect. All right, valuation. So valuation is obviously a key component of the whole process. It's going to drive a determination of a buyer as to whether or not they want to pursue a business. It's going to drive a seller's approach as to whether or not they want to pursue a sale. So understanding the components of valuation is very important. These different components and these different approaches to private company valuation are applicable across all private companies as well as Amazon-based businesses. So the first approach to valuation is the income approach. And in the income approach, we're really trying to gauge benefit, or more specifically, cash flow, current cash flow or future cash flow. The next approach, the market approach to valuation, is looking at market data. The income approach is really an internal approach. The market approach is an external approach. With the market approach, we're looking for comparable transactions in the market that we can use to guide value. The third approach, the cost or asset approach, is looking at a company's balance sheet and determining what the value is, the net asset value specifically, of that company is. All three approaches are used in private company valuation. The key thing to remember is every business, and specifically every Amazon-based business, is unique. It's one of a kind. There's really no asset like it. So the valuation approaches that are used have to be tailor fit for that particular business. So in some instances, we'll be combining all three. In other instances, we would be using just one. The key to remember with respect to valuation, ultimately, the transaction that's consummated at the end between a willing buyer and a willing seller establishes value. That is really the best indication of value with respect to determining value, is what actually transpired in a sale. Okay, so the income approach. To start the income approach, we're really going to look at the income statement first, and specifically net income. So if we look at the example here, we start with revenue, we take out cost of goods sold, operating expenses, we get to net income, and then we're going to add back particular expenses that are unique to the owner of this business. And that's how we're going to get to cash flow. These add backs include things like owner compensation, what you're paid, non-cash expenses like depreciation, amortization. They'll include taxes, health benefits, one-time expenses that the company has incurred that will not be incurred going forward, any charitable donations or other personal expenses that have gone through the business that are not necessary to running the business. These add backs are referred to as, they're add backs, and basically what they drive to is what's referred to as seller discretionary earnings, or SDE. When people are looking at cash flow for a given business, they like to analyze it a few different ways. The first way is to look at the previous year, a previous tax cycle, and determine what cash flow was in the last full year of operations. Another way of looking at cash flow is monthly, to get a sense for what seasonality is in a given business. You know, obviously the holidays are going to be busier for some businesses than others. And then some folks like to look at the trailing 12 months to get a feel for what the most current cash flow is of a given business. So, obviously, we're halfway through the year, so looking at cash flow from 2018 isn't going to give you a good feel for what current cash flow is through this part of the year, through 2019. Okay, so once we've calculated cash flow, and in this example, we hypothetically determined that cash flow, net income plus add backs, SDE was $300,000. A market standard, for determining valuation is to apply a multiple to that cash flow. So in this case, we've applied a multiple of 3.5. So the hypothetical business valuation in this example is a little over $1 million. And again, that's looking at 300,000 of hypothetical cash flow times 3.5x or 3.5 times that cash flow to give us that hypothetical value. So as you can imagine, that approach is not ideal for determining what future cash flow is going to be, because the value of a business is going to be largely driven by what expectations are for that business going forward. So, a good way of looking at cash flow in addition to current cash flow is future cash flow. So here we've done the same exercise where we have built future periods. We refer to the income statement as a pro forma income statement, future period statement of cash flow as well, so that we can see what an optimized version or a likely version of a given company is. So we can get a feel for what the future cash flow of that company is going to be. All right. So when we're looking at future cash flow, it's important to discount that future cash flow. Now, we're not going to go into the details of that in this webinar, but those future cash flow periods basically are discounted at a discount rate that is equal to a rate of return that someone would require on that particular business. Again, we don't need to get into the math of that, but the important point to remember is that in building a pro forma income statement and calculating future cash flow, you're getting a feel for what the business is going to do going forward, as opposed to what current cash flow is showing you insofar as what the business has done in the past. And again, the future cash flow approach is probably a better way of determining value. At Global Wired, we do not build that specific discount model of cash flow. We do, however, put a great deal of effort into building the pro forma income statement and laying out an optimized version of what a company can do in the future so that a particular buyer and the seller can get a feel for what that cash flow is. And again, we have the ability to discount that cash flow and come up with a current value of that future cash flow. But the obvious first step is to lay out the pro forma income statement to get a feel for what that future cash flow is going to be in each forward period. Okay, so the market approach. The market approach is a little bit different than the income approach. Here again, it's an external view of value. We are looking for market examples of things that have traded that we can associate a given company with. So there are three general tenets of the market approach. The first is the transaction method. And with the transaction method, we're looking for examples with a specific company where that company has done a trade, whether it's sell a part of itself, whether it's raised money, where value has been established. Now, obviously, this is not going to be too applicable to what we're talking about here, but that is one of the tenets of the market approach. The second tenet is the guideline public company method, where we're looking for publicly traded securities that are going to be related to a given company that we're valuing. Again, not particularly applicable. This one, however, is the guideline transaction method. This is, in fact, used quite commonly with respect to establishing a range of value. And here, we're looking at specific examples of companies that have traded that have similar characteristics to the company that we're trying to value, whether it's the same line of business, whether it's the same industry, and we're looking for that historical data, the metrics of that particular company to use to establish value, whether it's cash flow of the company, revenue, EBITDA. Usually there's a multiple that is reported in some fashion that we can point to use as a guideline. With the market approach, there's some flaws. The first flaw is data integrity regarding sales data. So there are a number of different databases that carry sales data, and a lot of transactions are self-reported. So as you can imagine, the specifics of a given deal might not be precise. Really the only people that are going to have the precise data points of a deal are the buyer, the seller, and the intermediary that was helping put the deal together. So data integrity is the first issue with the market approach. Applicability across different Amazon businesses. We can get examples of companies that have traded in the pet space, and we can look at those multiples, but a multiple, and in particular median or average multiple, over a period of time is not necessarily going to be applicable to your specific business. So there's an issue with comparing apples and oranges, basically. The data set is historical in nature. It is looking at transaction data that's happened in the past. It's not considering what market multiples are doing in a given industry or with a given type of business going forward. So those are some of the limitations in using the market approach. So what we have found is that it is best thought of as really a rough and ready guide to value, not a key driver to value. It's something that you can look at to get a sense for where things have traded in the past, roughly, but again, it should not be a key determinant of where you see value. Oops. Got a little data issue here.
It zoomed out.
Okay. How do you zoom it back in?
Oh, yeah, here you go. Let me see.
Okay, sorry. Technical difficulty. Sorry, folks. There we go.
There you go, Joe.
All right.
All right.
Cool.
I could always cough some more.
You could. Yeah, right. So the cost or asset approach here, we're basically just looking at a company's balance sheet, and we're determining what the value, specifically the net asset value of the company is, where we're taking total assets, value of total assets, I should say, and subtracting the value of total liabilities to come up with an enterprise value. Again, with the cost approach, you have to determine value. You have to find out what the market value is for all of the assets that you have on the books. You have to determine what the cost would be of getting out of liabilities, and you would also have to determine what the value is of intangible assets, like Chris mentioned earlier in the webinar, like intellectual property or brand equity. I will say, though, that given the limitations of the cost or asset approach, it is still used for a component of valuation in looking at Amazon businesses, specifically in the use of valuing inventory. So if we go back to the example that we looked at earlier in the income approach, where we had a hypothetical business that had $300,000 roughly of cash flow, and we applied a 3.5 multiple, and we got to basically a little over $1 million in value. If that business had $200,000 of inventory, sellable inventory, that was basically on the books, and that was the true value of that inventory, then that amount could be added to valuation. So in that example, valuation would go from a little over $1 million to a little over $1.2 million. Okay, with respect to doing that, we have a lot of questions about inventory, obviously. If a company requires a certain amount of inventory to generate cash flow on an ongoing basis, then that amount of inventory really is baked into valuation if you're calculating it based on income. So the additive effect of inventory is really going to come into play when you have excess inventory above and beyond what you need to maintain cash flow or grow cash flow. All right, so the largest drivers in valuation. Really, the biggest driver in valuation is going to be changes in current cash flow. This is, for now, the market standard. The market today is really valuing most Amazon-based businesses on current cash flow. That is where you're going to see the biggest change in value if current cash flow changes. The next biggest mover is going to be changes in projected future cash flow. So again, going back to how we were calculating future cash flow, we were laying out pro forma income statements, and we were laying out an optimized version of the company and what we believed it could do going forward. Changes in that view, and hence changes in cash flow, are going to be large drivers of valuation as well. A good example would be, let's say you have an Amazon-based business and you're doing extremely well, and you've been doing well for the past 2 years, and you've got cash flow of, let's say, $500,000, and suddenly your account is suspended. Well, current cash flow is going to be a terrible way to look at the value of that particular business. Future cash flow, however, is going to solution through what that particular case would look like in the short term, and then what a resolution would look like, and basically sales resuming at the pace that they were probably on. So that picture could be accurately valued with future cash flow. So again, probably the second largest driver is going to be projected future cash flow. The third is going to just be changes in historical Amazon business multiples. Right now, the market is pretty hot for Amazon-based businesses. And if at some point in the future we see that change, either because of changes that Amazon makes or broader macroeconomic changes that take place, then you could see business multiples in general for Amazon-based businesses contract. And if we do see a contraction of some kind, there will be an effect on where a specific Amazon-based business multiple will likely trade. This is a slide that we put in a previous webinar, but I think it's applicable to valuation, something to think through in the context really of the key drivers of valuation the two most important ones are current cash flow and future cash flow. So how to enhance value? Well, the first thing is going to be positive yearly sales trends. If you are seeing year-over-year growth in top line and also in cash flow, then the valuation of your company is going to be higher. It's going to be higher on a current basis, current income basis, as well as a future basis. Diversified customer mix. If you have a diversified customer mix, you're going to be more immune to changes in economic cycles or changes with specific products. Marketing plan that identifies force multipliers where you can quickly increase revenue. Those increases in revenue are going to be baked into future periods where we're looking at future cash flow, and hence we're going to have a higher value for future cash flow. Brand awareness and loyalty, product differentiation and innovation, again, all key to ensuring that your cash flow going into the future is healthy. Same thing with barriers to competitive entry, vendor relationships, and a tight supply chain. Again, those are all going to ensure that you do not see interruptions to your current cash flow or to future cash flow. Management information systems, and the last one, transferability of the management model, again, are assuming that basically there is enough gestalt in place to transfer to a new owner, and that too is going to play a part in value. So as we pointed out in a previous webinar, obviously maximizing all these and optimizing these will increase both current and forecast cash flow and thus value. All right, so that concludes what we have to present today. So I guess we're at the Q&A section. So I guess we want to open the lines up, see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just getting into some conversations we've been having in our chat as well. We've had a couple polls up just as you guys have been presenting. The majority of the people that answered a poll, whether or not they would like to sell their business, the majority said maybe. So I'm excited that you guys are all here to kind of learn more information about selling your business. I'm going to start off the Q&A. I have a question for you guys. What's the difference? Because I've talked to you guys both about auction style business selling and then a listing style. What's the difference between those two? And for those of you that are listening to our webinar, jump on the chat, add in your questions, and we'll get to those as they come in as well.
Right. That's a great question, Kate. So an auction style sale is going to start without a sale price. Basically, you're going to present all of the essential information on a company to a group of buyers, and you're going to let those buyers establish value and submit a price to you that they are comfortable, and a deal structure that they're comfortable pursuing a deal with. So the sale price approach is different than that, obviously, where the information, the business information that is being laid out, and we refer to it as an offering memorandum, is put together in a way that a price can effectively be taken to those buyers, to the market, and worked against. So in many ways, the auction approach, valuation and ultimately price, is going to be driven by buyers, whereas the list price approach is going to be driven by the seller.
And our next question is going to also come from me. I threw up another poll of, where are you guys selling? Are you selling strictly on Amazon? Are you selling on Amazon and other marketplaces, or your own website? 73% who answered the poll said Amazon plus other marketplaces. How does that impact valuation?
I'm going to jump in that.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Sure, I'll answer that one, Kate. I think that what we have found is it depends. Being diversified onto other marketplaces in addition to Amazon just for the sake of being there isn't worth a great deal. It's worth a bullet point and potentially a little value from the standpoint of you've already done some work to be established in another channel. But beyond that, it's not worth much. Now, if you've begun or have exploited other channels such that they have real impactful value on your financials, and also probably as important or maybe even more important, that they are a driver of potential future growth of the company, then I would say, it has a significant value on ultimately, or a significant impact on the valuation. I think, all else being equal, most buyers would like diversification of channel. So, the more channels that, if you have most of the companies, really, or practically all that are probably represented here and on Amazon are consumer products businesses. So, being able to sell your products across multiple channels and have access to either multiple buyers or different ways to get to buyers is deemed to be a positive attribute. So to give you a very specific example, what we have seen is, let's say you have a company that is 100% Amazon only versus a company, let's say, that's around 50% or a little or less than 50% Amazon and not greater than 50% on any other channel. And they have the exact same cash flow, the exact same business attributes. I would suggest that more diversified model is likely worth at least another, we'll call it one multiple or more in terms of valuation. So to translate that into math, let's say that the 100% Amazon example on a $500,000 cash flow business is, let's say it's a 4 multiple there. So that'll be a $2 million valuation. Well, a 5 multiple or more, if you're diversified, would mean $2.5 million or higher. So beyond that, it gets very specific to the company, but I'd say it's worth, in my example, easily an extra multiple.
All right, going to and I'm just taking questions kind of as they came in during the presentation. And any of you guys that have questions, keep posting them in the chat. I'm adding them to a list. If you don't hear it right away, it's because you're essentially waiting in line. So this question is, I'm not sure if first name's Effie or if it's just EFY, but can you tell us how Amazon businesses are faring now compared to the past, considering unpredictability of Amazon / Trump? I don't know if she means president or he, could be a he, versus the growth of Amazon, but that's the question.
Well, I'll start, and Joe, I think you jump on. I think that in general, what we've seen is the market for Amazon businesses has continued to grow over the last 3 years, quite well. I would say that 2018 versus 2019 looks fairly similar. There's a lot of supply in the market, and we're seeing bifurcation as well, where we'll call it the better companies are starting to break away from the pack and are being treated markedly better than companies deemed not as good. I think that the tariff discussions and all that, it adds some uncertainty for buyers, but I think any halfway sophisticated potential buyer can get their arms around what tariffs are worth to a deal and not worth to a deal. So far what we've seen is not a huge impact overall. I don't know what you'd add to that.
Yeah, so what I would add is that we're seeing really an increase in interest from a lot of people that are new to the idea of owning an Amazon-based business. There are a lot of folks that are in the corporate space that are interested in retiring or switching careers, and there's really no slowing down at all of that money that's flowing into the space. So I think in general, there is a growing awareness that you can buy an Amazon-based business. You can learn it fairly quickly. You can basically consummate a transaction similar to the way you would with any other brick and mortar based business, and you're not bound to a location. So I think that awareness is growing, and we're seeing increased interest because of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. This comes from Rex. What URL? Do you have a specific place where you are listing current businesses for sale? So once you have offering material and that teaser info ready, where do you guys post that? How do you find your buyers?
Well, we access our buyers a number of ways, and a lot of it depends on the transaction. So our marketing strategy for any given deal is sort of customized to that deal. So there are some transactions that where it's appropriate for us to kind of use marketplaces to get the deal out there. Let's say like a biz buy sell, something like that. But there are a lot of transactions where we wouldn't use a tool like that, and we would utilize our extensive database in addition to other platforms, like an Axial or a PitchBook or anything like that, to ultimately put together a strategy and kind of a prospective buyer list and market directly to parties that we feel are appropriate for the deal. So it's really deal by deal, but we we use the strategy that we think is most appropriate.
And we do have, it looks like we have your contact info up. That is Chris's direct email. You don't see him right now, but he was there earlier. So if you guys have any other questions that maybe we don't get to, or maybe they're a little more complicated, feel free, you can email him directly. Let's jump back into our list of questions. This comes from, and I'm sorry if I get your name wrong, but Yannick. How does a clean Amazon selling account factor into valuation?
Well, I think it depends on what clean means. I mean, I would say that, buyers are going to expect that at the time that a company, transfers, that they are receiving effectively a clean company and a clean account at that time. And so, obviously that doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of reviews have to be great, or there's never been a problem, or you've never had a customer service complaint or anything like that. But obviously if there are products currently suspended, or the account itself is suspended, then a buyer wouldn't want to take control over that, at that time until the issue was resolved. So I don't exactly know what the definition of clean is that listener is using, but I'd say that's my best answer.
Yeah. No, that all makes sense. I mean, most buyers, all buyers, are going to expect basically a clean account to start. It's going to be difficult to transfer the business if there are issues with the account.
All right, question from Melanie. Retail arbitrage or wholesale, no unique IP. Are those businesses being sold, and what does that process look like versus something that maybe they own their own brand?
Well, they're being sold. We're seeing a number of resellers moving, but typically someone that does not have their own brand, has not established their own brand, and is basically doing retail arbitrage, they're going to have a lower valuation. The business multiple that is going to be applied to current and future cash flow is going to be lower than someone who has taken the time to build a brand and basically has the ability to defend that brand, whether through brand registry or a host of other things. So yes, the short answer is we do see those businesses trading, but they are going to be trading at a little bit of a discount to companies that have a brand.
Well, and one other thing I'll add to that is things that can help a resale business achieve a higher valuation are things like exclusive agreements, or being part of a fairly exclusive group that has access to certain products that are in high demand. Things like that can mitigate the valuation, we'll call it the difference there, and the reduction. I mean, really what the market has effectively said is they believe that resellers just, they don't have the protections that companies that have established their own brand have. And there's an assumption that at a future date, either more competition is going to come in or Amazon's going to potentially do something to really dramatically affect their business negatively. And all that shows up as a higher risk investment, which equals a lower value.
Our next question is going to be kind of more based on buyers that might be interested. Do you have any investors that, maybe they're interested in not necessarily buying a company, but investing in the company, not operating the whole business? For example, this question comes from Brad, and he says, we are over leveraged, which is slowing our ability to grow. I'm sure many investors could buy our debt and make money on the difference in their ability to borrow at a much lower interest rate than we are able to.
Absolutely. There are just a whole host of funded sponsors that are entering the space that recognize this problem, where we have Amazon-based sellers that are seeing explosive growth and they just don't have the capital to keep up with that growth. The PE, the private equity or funded sponsor space, is really designed to facilitate growth through the application of capital in those situations. And the Amazon-based business ecosystem is somewhat new to a lot of these groups, but we're seeing more groups every day that are interested in participating in minority stakes where they're not going to take the whole company and basically acquire it. They're basically just going to take a piece of it, acquire a piece of equity, or provide a debt solution of some kind as part of taking a piece of the company. So yes, the short answer is we know a number of different people that are interested in providing solutions like that.
This question comes from Sophia, and we're running towards the bottom of our questions. If you have any final questions, jump on there, let us know. I've also posted in the chat for everyone watching a link to consultation. If you want to schedule a consultation with Global Wired, you can also do that by emailing Chris directly, which is on the screen. And then there's also the valuation tool, which is just kind of cool to play with and see what your company is currently valued. But this question comes from Sophia. Can a brand on Amazon UK be sold?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The beautiful thing about an Amazon-based business is it can be located anywhere in the world in any marketplace, and it can be transferred around the globe. So absolutely, we're working with some UK-based sellers today. So the answer to that is absolutely yes.
All right, we have a question from Martin. Talk to us about brokerage fees. What does that kind of break down to in terms of the percentage of the sale of the business?
Yeah, so every one of those is unique because obviously every engagement is unique. We mentioned earlier in the presentation, every Amazon-based business is unique. It's a one-of-a-kind asset. So taking that one-of-a-kind asset to the market is going to be a unique engagement. And our fee structure and anyone else's fee structure for that matter in the marketplace, should be guided by what that particular engagement is going to look like. How much upfront work is going to be required to understand the business, to get everything in place that's necessary to effectively market the business. How big is the market for the business? How much marketing is going to be required to get a top valuation and a good deal structure? So all of those things go into determining ultimately what engagement fees are charged as they should be. They're basically sized by the engagement.
And this is going to kind of be a question from a comment that Brad made, but it's also something that I'm interested in, and I haven't seen a lot out there. Instagram launched their kind of shopping network a couple months ago, and you also have Pinterest as a possible sales platform. How are you guys seeing an impact on valuation? Are investors or buyers interested if you are successfully selling on Instagram?
Well, I think different channels certainly helps because, again, going back to cash flow, having a diverse, source of income is obviously a good thing. You definitely want that, from a valuation standpoint. So I think it certainly helps. It certainly helps that you are successfully penetrating these different channels and showing that there's extra demand in these different channels. So yeah, it does help, and I think we're seeing a lot more of that. I think Amazon-based sellers that started out exclusively in, say, the U.S. marketplace, are much more willing to look at other marketplaces and much more willing, to go to other channels now, based on the success they've had in Amazon. So I guess the short answer is yes. I don't know if you would.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too that Instagram in particular, it's a double whammy because a lot of people look at social media presence now as an indicator of brand. What kind of brand value the company currently has, what is its brand potential. So that, with Instagram, in order to sell on Instagram, it's usually you need to, develop a following there. So it's kind of best of both worlds. You get some value for the fact that you're building a brand on social media, and you're also getting some value for the fact that you have another channel that is driving sales.
We have a couple more questions. If no other questions come in while you guys are answering this, I'll wrap after these questions. First, though, Rex, he's asking about brokerage commission. Is that added to inventory? In other words, is a fee deducted from cost of goods? Does that make sense?
It does.
Kind of, yeah. I think that, again, I'll sort of echo what Joe said. The brokerage fees are usually customized, by deal. With respect to inventory, it's interesting. Inventory can play a few different roles in a transaction in terms of how it's priced. The buyer universe is somewhat diversified around the idea of, am I going to just add inventory value to a theoretical, business value without inventory, or am I going to expect some normalized amount of inventory to be included in the sale price? And so, based on, how we choose to structure the offering and how we're treating inventory in the offering, will ultimately affect how brokerage fees or commissions are calculated with respect to the inventory portion. So that wasn't necessarily a very specific answer, but unfortunately, because every engagement is different, the answer is going to be deal by deal in terms of how it's treated.
So you can send Chris an email and he can get you a more detailed answer. That's probably as you guys are discussing. Yeah.
Yep.
This comes from Paul. Paul's based in Australia and has a growing business, but wants to set up an LLC and have a UK partner. They're looking at Australia, US, and UK as options to set up. Do you have any advice on any benefit with being incorporated in either of these countries in particular, if we are wanting to exit our business in the next 12 months? For example, a U.S. buyer can get financing easier if our LLC is in the U.S.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, that helps. But I'll say if it's an SBA type financing, 12 months doesn't help you because you need to be in business for 2 years. Yes. So I would say, our view is that there are more buyers of Amazon businesses in the U.S. than any other country right now. So if you're going to choose a place to be domiciled, we would always suggest the U.S. Because it makes it a little easier for a U.S. buyer to do a deal. Now, is it impossible? No. I mean, deals get done all the time where you have a U.S. buyer who's purchasing the assets of a UK business or Australian business. I mean, it's, again, not terribly complex, but there's a little more cost involved, a little more brain damage. And so if you can limit some of that, you're just going to have a bigger audience for the deal because buyers, for the most part, are somewhat inherently lazy.
Yeah, that's true.
They want you to make it as easy as possible for them. And if someone else is, they're maybe more inclined to go that route.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. It's always fun to kind of pick your guys' brain and learn more about the process of selling your business. And you guys dove into a lot of information today. For any of you guys that joined us to watch, thank you for your time. It's summer. It's hard to just sit at a computer, especially when kids are off and you want to be off vacationing and having fun with your families. But thank you guys for joining us. If you missed any part of it, we did record the whole thing. We'll be sending it out to all that registered. And if you have additional questions, feel free to send them to Chris. He will be more than happy to address them. Thank you guys. Talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Yep.